Penguin Random House Audio presents MeatEater's Campfire Stories. Discoveries, revelations, and near misses with Stephen Rinella. When we began work on this volume, we put out a call to our friends and listeners asking about the wildest discoveries and revelations that they'd had in the outdoors. We were looking for those experiences in nature that upended understandings, meaning those understandings of our history and culture, but also our understandings of ourselves, what we're made of, who we are, and what we can endure. And of course, we also wanted to hear about the just plain far out, weird, and surprising experiences that people have had in remote places. What you're about to hear is the best of those. These are great stories about wild discoveries, defining moments, and close calls, as told by the very people who experienced them, and in some cases, survived them. But before we get started, take a moment and try to guess what was, far and away, the number one topic of the many submissions we received when we asked for stories about discovery. Bodies. That's right, discoveries of human remains. From what we'd read, you could almost start to think that hunting and fishing in North America was a real macabre occupation, a sort of roundabout strategy for solving cold cases involving missing people. Now, there are two things I don't want to happen. I don't want you to think this volume is full of dead body stories. It ain't, except for a couple of really good ones. And I don't want you to be discouraged from getting out in nature based on the fear that what you'll find out there is going to wind up giving you nightmares. I myself have spent an insane amount of time in the outdoors and have yet to find even a pinky bone. Full disclosure, I did find a bunch of human finger bones that had been disinterred by prairie dogs, but they were in an old New Mexico cemetery, so the bones were, more or less, right where they belonged. I did, though, have a close call with finding a missing body. Years ago in high school, I was trapping a small marsh for muskrats in western Michigan, about a mile from my parents' home. I was in and out of that spot for about a week, checking traps every day. And unbeknownst to me, during that time, a deer hunter had shot himself, leaning against a tree just a couple 100 yards away from where I would park my truck, and even closer to where I had some muskrat sets. His body laid there for a couple of days before he was found. He and I, or what was left of him, had been together in that marsh over that period of time. After the discovery, I awaited being contacted by authorities. I just figured that they'd know I'd been in and out of there a bunch during that time span, and they'd have some questions about what I might have witnessed. I never heard from them. But I did hear from the body, so to speak. I started having this recurring dream that only a trapper could fully understand. It had to do with a muskrat feed bed set, where you place a small foothold trap on what's called a feed bed, a dinner plate-sized mat of floating vegetation that a muskrat builds, usually comprised of his choicest feed, such as the roots of reeds and cattails. A muskrat uses a feed bed to get out of the water and eat, and they'll visit their feed beds habitually. To make a feed bed set, I would usually place my trap in the center of the feed bed and attach a 3-foot length of 14-gauge wire to the trap's chain. The other end of the wire I'd wrap around the bottom end of a wooden stake made from a 5-foot tall aspen pole. You drive that stake into the muck of the marsh out in deep water, and the set is complete. That night, the muskrat climbs onto the feed bed to eat, gets caught in the trap, and then dives into the water, where it sinks down to the bottom and drowns. When you check the set, the first thing you'll see is that the trap's gone. So you drag your foot along the bottom of the marsh until you feel the wire, and then lift it up to your hand and pull the muskrat out. In this recurring dream, though, I'd for some reason follow the wire down into the water with my bare hand until I found not the fur of a muskrat at the end of the wire, but rather the hair of a human head. The dream, which started with the discovery of that body that I never even personally saw, stayed with me for years. Actually finding human remains, an experience I haven't had, is something that'll definitely have a lasting effect. Thankfully, happily, not all discoveries you make out in nature are so grim. I've found scores of interesting things out in the woods, some of which I gave only a little thought to, some that I keep around just as a reminder or a sort of totem to mark the place and circumstances of the find in my mind. Most of them are pretty much meaningless, except to me and, presumably, whoever lost them in the first place. I've got a fly rod that I found at the bottom of a deep hole on Montana's Yellowstone River, which I extracted with great care and then promptly broke by slamming it in a car door. I have a Leatherman multi-tool I found while canoeing in Alaska. I could see all these ravens circling around above a willow flat off in the distance, and I beached my canoe to take a look. I found where a hunter had recently butchered a moose, and then the gut pile had been mopped up by grizzly bears. The bears were so thorough in their cleanup that the hunter's Leatherman, which he'd accidentally left behind, was as licked clean and shiny as if it had been through a dishwasher. In a box on my desk, I have a handful of old rifle shell casings, some likely more than a century old, that I collected in places, like at the crest of a small hill on the Arctic plain or at the top of a steep cliff face in remote British Columbia, where you can be damn sure it was shot for real and not for target practice. For years, my primary canoe paddle was one that I found in a drift pile along Michigan's White River. It was marked property of a Wasapie scout camp. I had worked at that same scout camp as a dishwasher for a summer in high school, and I had a real bone to pick with them from an employee's perspective, so I viewed my recovery of their paddle as a sort of comeuppance, like they owed it to me. But then I, too, lost the paddle. I'd love to know what, if anything, that paddle means to whoever found it next. If you have it, please scratch out a Wasapie and write property of Steve Rinella. Finds of an archaeological or paleontological nature, for many of us who grew up scouring the landscape in hopes of finding a perfect Indian arrowhead, are the stuff of dreams. You'll hear a few such in-depth stories here, but we'll start with a quick one, as explained in an email to us from the outdoor writer Ben Long. He writes, "One summer in the late 1990s, I was accompanying the Canadian archaeologist Barney Reeves in northern Montana. It was during a drought, and we walked along the mud flats of a reservoir that had been drawn down. His trained eye soon found small rings of stones scattered around the ground. Once you looked for them, you could identify them readily as fire pits. They had not been exposed for many years, and Barney had conducted a study of this ancient village. The hundreds of fire pits he had examined had mostly the bones of bighorn sheep, so these fires were evidently from thousands of years ago, before the era of the great bison hunting cultures. Barney said he had found many sheep bones, very few elk bones, and only one black bear bone in all the pits he had examined. He explained that the fire pits that were ringed with an ordinary mix of local rocks were cooking or warming fires, but some of the fire rings were made entirely of an iron-rich red sedimentary rock found in the area. If the rings were made of red stones, he believed they were ceremonial fires, for example, associated with a sweat lodge. A few moments after he explained all this, I found a fire pit surrounded by red rock. Upon inspection, we
Sample complete. Ready to continue?